Welcome back to Dragon Ball Dissection December, the seemingly never-ending Dragon Ball Dissection Marathon. Last time we got started on Dragon Ball GT proper, with me taking the entire episode to wind my way through just the first episode. I don't know if things are going to change with episode 2. Spoilers. They don't. Episode 2 has always been rather fascinating to me. Truly, it and the first episode together form what could basically be considered the pilot of the series. The first episode establishes the conflict, but it's not until the end of this episode that they actually get out into space. Imagine, for comparison, if the very first chapter of Dragon Ball wasn't double length, so that chapter 1 had Goku meeting Bluma, but it's not until chapter 2 that they actually team up and have an adventure together. That's what these two episodes are like. Frankly, I wonder if these could have been streamlined a bit to only take one episode, given how many redundancies and fluff there are in this one. I feel we could have skipped Pon's introduction in episode 1 in favor of her introduction here, and Goku's kidnapping subplot in this episode could have been removed entirely without really sacrificing anything of importance. However, I have to admit I really like the leisurely pace of this episode. First off, as I've pointed out in the past, I just enjoy getting to see the characters interact and live their lives, in a franchise that more often than not skips over that in favor of constant action and adventure. In this particular case, it's even more important given that the show is about to head to outer space and leave most of these locations and characters behind. Many of the faces we see in this episode are here to give Dragon Ball GT its send-off, to establish a contrast between what was and what will be. In addition, we are clearly still setting up the motives and temperaments of our lead characters, the ones we'll actually be following into space. And while that probably could be done more economically, I'd rather take a little too much time than too little. The main structure of this episode is that Bluma and Gohan are readying a ship to take Goku into space to search for these new Dragon Balls. While Goku doesn't strongly object to being sent on this quest, he does suggest maybe they could just use their Dragon Balls to go to another planet. I think that's a bit interesting given what ultimately happens. Gohan immediately volunteers to go into space with his father. This leads Pan to insist that she wants to go too, but she's shot down. That's why, as much as I enjoy it, I could argue her introduction in the first episode ends up being somewhat unnecessary. This episode covers everything needed to establish her character, but does it in a way that's much more consistent with how she will actually be portrayed in the series as a whole. This is a guess on my part, but I feel like Pon's portrayal in the first episode lends credence to the misconception that GT takes place 10 years after the end of the previous series. Her portrayal as a hyper-competent girl about town who takes out bank robbers and feels her kidified grandpa is beneath her in the social pecking order feels like it fits with a 14-year-old. This episode's Pan, though, is definitely 9. Her family refuses to even humor her about going. Both of her parents blow her off when she offers to help prep the spaceship. When she is angered by that, she kicks a dent in the ship. And because she is a child, rather than own up to that, she tries to hide it. When she is begging for a seat on the trip, she is literally having to stand on the furniture just to be on the same level as everybody else. In frustration at not being taken seriously, she runs to her grandpa, Satan. Getting to see all these family dynamics at play makes this episode worth it for me. When Pan gets sick of one branch of her family, she visits another branch. When she feels she can't confide in one grandpa, she reaches out to the other one. To return to my speculation about Pan's feelings of abandonment, Grandpa Satan might have filled a gap in her life left by her grandpa Goku. And while he is ultimately very protective and treats her like a child in terms of the affection he can't help but give her, he actually stands up for her, gives her the validation she wants. I also have to point out my embarrassment that it took me far too many years, decades, to understand the somewhat subtle visual joke here. In my defense, I'd only ever seen this on a very bad quality VHS fan sub, so maybe I just couldn't see any better. But when the waitress delivers their orders, Mr. Satan looks at her as she retreats. I always thought he was just sneaking a peek at her butt. Now I realize he was waiting until she was out of eyeshot to swap their beverages around because she had mistakenly switched their orders and he was embarrassed to call attention to it. And I bring this up because it's important. The waitress makes assumptions about them that each of them feels insecure about. Mr. Satan ordered the parfait, but grown men aren't supposed to enjoy sweet, feminine treats like that. It was Pan who ordered the black coffee because, despite not enjoying the taste, she views it as a symbol of adulthood. And unlike her other family and the waitress, who all see her as a child, Grandpa Satan does not object to this. He gives it to her freely, even if he is embarrassed by his own drink choice enough to pretend that it's his. Pan is a child who yearns to grow up too fast, and these scenes do a great job of establishing that. In tandem with her introduction in the previous episode, it does present a funny turnabout. We know Pan has the capacity to take charge of a situation, but her family doesn't see it. This episode better gets to the heart of what her motivation is. There's no seemingly off-the-point stuff like boys being intimidated by her. That's why I feel if you had to trim this down, the scenes from that episode would be on the cutting room floor before these would. Episode 1 gives the audience a more exciting introduction, but this gives them a more useful one. That said, I can't bring myself to object to Episode 1's Pan scenes because, given how much the series is going to hammer in this point that Pan is mopey and whiny and in over her head, it is really nice to have at least this moment showing how awesome she can be. Pan certainly needs more introduction than Goku, which is why I could argue that the scenes we get with him aren't terribly necessary. Pan is a totally different person than she was the last time we saw her, but Goku is Goku. We don't really need to establish him. Even if we did, the first episode does a fine enough job of that while connecting to things that are actually important to the plot. Still, I like the hijinks. 2 kidnappers are scouting out Capsule Corporation because they want to abduct Bra for ransom. They end up mistaking Pan for her, which I'd argue is understandable given that Bra has no role in this episode, no speaking lines, and doesn't interact with anybody. In fact, the one brief shot in which she appears and, for the very first time in animated Dragon Ball, is identified by name, doesn't happen until several minutes later. Seems kinda weird to hang a major plot point for the episode on someone the audience might not even realize exists. As if that first mistaken identity wasn't bad enough, the henchman accidentally grabs Goku instead when Pan flies off. Figuring Goku must be an illegitimate grandchild, they keep him occupied through food and amusements while trying to get in touch with his certainly frantic grandparents. Except, of course, that it turns out his grandparents aren't terribly concerned. Vegeta in particular finds the whole thing amusing and hangs up on them. I love it. Ultimately, it's Goku's attempts at being helpful, bringing them a payphone to try another ransom attempt, that scares them off. It's cute. It's pointless. It's sharing time with enough important plots that it doesn't draw out its thin premise past its natural conclusion. Just in case you needed to remember that Goku is a silly idiot without a care in the world, well, here you go. But you probably didn't need it. Still, I do like that the kidnappers bear strong resemblances to Harry and Marv from the Home Alone franchise. It's also cute that the one in charge is voiced by Tatsuta Naoki, Oolong's voice actor. Oolong does not make an appearance here. Still, it's fitting in an episode that is paying tribute to several members of the cast that his performer at least makes a cameo. Episode 2 actually opens by focusing on another character. It's Trunks, arriving at a never-before-seen Capsule Corporation office building. He's the young president. I'm not sure if this is meant to imply that Trunks has taken this beloved, family-owned business in a more corporate direction, or if it's simply meant to be an area of the business we never really saw before. Either is plausible given that we have, well, never really seen any element of the business side. The Capsule Corporation headquarters/living space has always come across more like a family of eccentric weirdos, the idle rich indulging in their own hobbies. They're like the Addams Family, but as techies instead of goths. To see that the business has employees who maybe do things like business and selling products and saying words like merger and meeting and work is a fun new side of things. Trunks is beloved by all the office ladies and even the gentlemen. Wait, is that Otokuski? He followed him all the way from the tournament? Somebody call HR! Trunks is beloved despite the fact that he's prone to skipping out of said job to fly around and be free. The show treats this as a fairly regular occurrence given the reaction of his assistant, and that Trunks keeps his casual clothes in a capsule for just such an occasion. However, the second time we see him do this, he doesn't quite get away with it. Vegeta is waiting for him. It turns out that Vegeta has decided that Goku and Gohan going into space together would result in an entire series consisting of Nozawa Masako talking to herself, and that's just a little bit weird. Instead, he recruits Trunks and Goten. And Goten features so little in this episode that you should immediately realize he's a red herring. Well, you know, that in the opening sequence, the ending sequence, and the eye catches that give it away. Goten has one character trait. He talks to girls on the phone about dates. Frankly, that's just an extrapolation of that single line from the original series he has about the tournament interrupting a date. Now it's become his entire personality. Naturally, he delays entering the spaceship with Goku and Trunks because he gets a phone call. Goku and Trunks, in turn, are surprised to run into Pan, who is emboldened by her conversation with Grandpa Satan and the knowledge she earlier gleaned from her mother of where the start button is. And so, Pan launches the three of them into space, leaving Goten behind. After all, if it had been Goku and Goten going into space together, that would result in an entire series consisting of Nozawa Masako talking to herself, and that's just a little bit weird. To Goten's credit though, his reaction to being incinerated by a spaceship launching next to him, that being telling the girl on the other end of the call that he can make their date after all, is a hilarious button to that scene. I love that the final configuration of the team to blast off into space owes itself to hijinks and substitutions. It feels much more real, much more engaging. Besides, this is an unlikely trio, three characters who really have little to do with each other. Goku and Gohan going into space makes sense. Goku, Trunks, and Pan going into space isn't the most logical choice, therefore it needs to come about through a comedy of errors. Ultimately, we end up with the obvious main character, the replacement pick, and the replacement who wasn't picked at all, the stowaway, if you will. And that less than stellar pedigree promises a more interesting dynamic. But let's talk some more about that replacement pick. Of the three leads chosen from the established cast, Trunks gets the least introduction. Goku and Pan both enter the story in the first episode, and they continue to be explored in the second. Trunks does not appear at all until now, and he's still having to share the spotlight with their plots. Ultimately, if you put it all together, we briefly see Trunks at work, we see him escape twice, we see him go on the mission. That's it. Compared to Goku and Pan, that's practically nothing. And I've always had difficulty understanding exactly what his setup is, how it relates to his character. See, the way I'd always interpreted it, Vegeta entangles Trunks in this because he notices him slacking off in his job, like how he forces him to join the tournament for the same reason. Therefore, just as Pan's character flaw to be tamed is her ego, Trunks's is his lack of responsibility. And that does follow through, technically. As Trunks goes into space with a magically de-aged man-child with no sense of responsibility, and a girl with an inflated sense of self-importance, it falls to Trunks to fulfill the role of straight man. He has to keep everybody on task. And while the kid's source of comedy is primarily to get into wacky hijinks, his is to react to the wacky hijinks. It's a job he accomplishes quite well. It does, however, mean he never develops responsibility or struggles to maintain it. He instead falls into that role immediately. And that absolutely makes sense, don't get me wrong, it's just that it doesn't really give him anywhere to go. Here's what I was getting wrong though. I always remembered Trunks as this lazy pretty boy who was shirking the duties of his company to run off and have fun. Even his glasses are just a facade of business, to look smart. He doesn't need them, he throws them away. Poser! Of course Vegeta's right in saying that Bluma can take over Trunks' duties because Trunks is running the company into the ground. But he's not. He's doing a great job. In his introductory scene, all of his employees are rattling off his business accomplishments and how in demand his presence is with other companies. He doesn't have to learn responsibility, because he's already responsible. So why do I misremember this? Well, because everything we hear about Trunks in this episode illustrates how awesome he is. However, everything we see Trunks do in this episode demonstrates how much of a screw-up he is. Show don't tell is a wonderful axiom, and one of the reasons why is because what we see a character do leaves much more of an impression than what we are told he supposedly does. And that's especially true when what we see and what we are told are at odds with each other. So that left me in an awkward position of having to refigure out what Trunks is all about here. I think I might have stumbled into it. I have no idea, but I'm gonna try, darn it. Rather than Trunks lacking responsibility, what he lacks is challenge. He's already conquered the business world, so much so that he can simply duck out of his office window and still win. He wants something more out of his life. His dance in the clouds is his Disney Princess I Want song. No more reports, no more rat race. I wanna find adventure in space. Dark purple hair, an ascot for flair. I'm Princess Trunks. I'm really taking this copyrighted music thing seriously, aren't I? And so his dad is giving him the adventure he seeks, whether he wants it or not. My theory runs into a bit of an issue though, given how Trunks seems completely reluctant to go on this mission. His excuse that he has to run the company only really works as a joke if it is an obvious con that Vegeta sees through, not the actual truth. If this is intended to satisfy an itch Trunks has, it never really comes up again. At best, I can say he takes to this role like a duck to water, which could imply that Vegeta was right to push him in this direction. Trunks just doesn't realize yet that this is what he wanted to do. Maybe my confusion comes down to what I said a minute ago. Trunks doesn't really have much time to make an impression, so what's here feels a bit slapdash. A bit. Like I said with Pan, there are what could be interpreted as minor inconsistencies, but it's nothing that scuttles the show. According to one of the show's writers, Mai Kawa-Atsushi, both of Goku's traveling companions were ultimately chosen due to their connection to Bluma. In effect, they wanted characters who could recreate the dynamic of that original duo. Pan is Bluma in terms of her temperament. She's domineering, reckless, selfish. She was an easy role to cast. The third role, however, was not. He said they debated over who to choose. They knew they didn't just want to cast someone solely because he was strong, because they wanted a character whose role it was to struggle to hold the other two back. Ultimately, they chose Trunks because Trunks could more easily be given Bluma's remaining character trait, the one that wouldn't have worked for Pan. They needed someone who was technologically savvy, and given that he has a Capsule Corporation background, that was easy to believe. In that same Maekawa interview, though, the one trait he seems completely sure about is Trunks' great sense of responsibility. I've already gone on about how Trunks is characterized as the responsible one. At a glance, that seems odd given that this Trunks is the older version of this character. He's anything but responsible. As such, I've seen many fans over the years complain that GT basically puts future Trunks into this show and hopes we're so enamored by his presence that we don't notice that it shouldn't really be him. And I get that. The show so associates him with future Trunks that Trunks uses a sword in the opening, even though he never uses a sword in the show itself. Playing the straight man, the wet nurse, the annoying nanny, is basically what that alternate reality Trunks' role was in the Cell arc. The Boo arc had consciously moved away from that characterization, demonstrating that a Trunks growing up in pampered luxury instead of a hellish apocalypse would be a spoiled brat. Love him or hate him, that's the core identity of this timeline's Trunks. So logically, putting him in this adventure with these other two should result in the craziest, stupidest space party bus, right? Well, maybe. Surprisingly though, this has never bothered me. This arrogant, loud-mouthed, entitled case for birth control was 8. When I was 8, I was pretty much the exact same character. And then something happened. I grew up. And honestly, I feel I grew into the same polite, cautious, methodical thinker that he did. You know, a dweeb. Kids change a lot, especially when they're young and developing their personalities. Just like I can totally buy Pan grows from a sweet innocent into, Trunks. I can just as easily buy that Trunks grew up and learned some responsibility. Maybe some of his traits inherently overlap with his other self, but that's fine. They have similar outlooks and take similar actions, but I feel this Trunks is far more delicate and far less tortured. I can see the shadow of the boy he once was. It's not overt, but I think it's there. Ultimately, I think the writers being less sure of Trunks' inclusion compared to the other two shows in his comparatively meager and possibly confusing introduction. Regardless, this might be my favorite incarnation of Trunks. I love that this is the trio they chose to go into space. Let's see if the show stays interesting once they get there. That, however, will have to wait until next time. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you're enjoying Dragon Ball Dissection December. I'll see you in the next video next week. Unless you join up as a new $10 or higher patron, in which case you can see the next video right now. At least, assuming I'm not falling dreadfully behind schedule. Well, if you're hearing this in the video, that means that it's fine. I would have edited this out if the next video wasn't done. So I guess that means it's done, whatever it is. You'll have to come back here and tell past me what it was about. Was it any good? I hope so. I love time travel. That's why I have a serious, tortured alternate timeline version of myself with a sword. One who doesn't make the Dragon Ball Dissection deadlines. It's very sad.